Loneliness is being called the new epidemic of our times, and it's hitting men especially pretty hard. Today, I want to talk about why the term toxic masculinity is at the heart of it and how it relates to the ongoing men's mental health crisis. You're listening to Fed Up and Figuring It Out, unpacking politics, culture, and global power. Each week, we dive into a new topic from capitalism and fascism to gender roles, red pill culture, and everything in between. This isn't an experts podcast, but a university student with a passion for research and ranting and pushing through indifference. Have you ever thought, why does it all feel like bullshit? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Priya Migneault. As always, everything cited throughout the episode will be in this episode's description. A quick trigger warning before we start this podcast is that today's episode does talk about suicide and mental health. Today, we're going to be talking about toxic masculinity and how it relates to the ongoing loneliness problem we're seeing with men. You may have seen the term male loneliness epidemic going around. And I think that's really interesting considering they're referring to the fact that men are not in romantic relationships and that's why they're lonely. But women are obviously single at the same rates as men. And yet we don't have a female loneliness epidemic. Before I start today's episode, I want to start by saying obviously I am not a man. And I have gathered these conclusions and these findings from scientific articles and different research publications, as well as my own experiences and perspectives on men and watching how they react with one another or with women. And this has been both online and offline. And so this is how I've come to these findings. I just wanted to preface this because I think it's important for me to say I don't know everything about the male experience. I can't say I do. And yet, these are the things I have observed, and I think it's important for me to talk about these correlations between toxic masculinity and men's mental health that I've been noticing. The term toxic masculinity has been thrown around a lot in recent years. And this is not to say that masculinity is inherently bad or toxic. Actually, it can be quite good. But no, not all masculinity is bad. But there is a narrow version and a harmful version of masculinity called toxic masculinity that is very damaging to men and their relationships. First, let's define what toxic masculinity is and how it presents itself in different individuals. A few traits of toxic masculinity are emotional suppression, except anger. And I think we've seen this a lot with the dominant stream of men, where they're like, oh, don't be emotional or don't let boys cry. And I am grateful that I haven't heard that in a while. Like it is getting better, I think, in some capacity for many men. But emotional suppression, except for anger, is one key trait of toxic masculinity. The other one is dominance as proof of worth, trying to dominate others to prove you're worthy of something. Avoiding vulnerability ties back into the first one. Seeing care, softness, or dependency as weak when they're kind of key parts of living in community and being human. Unconditional physical toughness, like trying to be as physically tough as possible, which ties into showing physical aggression. So if you're as physically tough as you can be, being physically aggressive is like a big part of toxic masculinity as well. Showing domination toward people who aren't heterosexual. And I have heard this many times online, in movies, in locker rooms, whatever the case is, but it's like, oh, I've noticed men are particularly worse for it, but they're like, oh, that's gay. Or they call their friends gay like it's an insult. And it's like, being gay is not insulting. And women don't pass that around. Like, we're such a lesbian. Like, that's not something we do to the same degree as men. So it is interesting. Like, it's heavily heterosexually based, this toxic masculinity. It's also practicing hyper independence, exhibiting sexual aggression or violence. So being like, I want to sleep with people, yet it's my right. Like, that kind of thing. It's like sexual domination is also a thing. Like, you could be dominant in the bedroom, whatever. But when you're like, I deserve this, it's my right, and you're going to be aggressive and violent to get sexual things, that's toxic. That's toxic as hell. Exhibiting anti-feminist behavior, viewing women as less than. So if you think men are better than women, that's a trait of toxic masculinity. Championing heterosexuality above all else as the unattainable norm. So again, we tied back into the heterosexual aspect of this. You can't really be gay in this toxic masculine world. Being violent having emotional insensitivity, so lacking empathy, lacking compassion, lacking relationality to other people. To summarize toxic masculinity, it is basically the belief that men should be unemotional, dominant, breadwinners, not feminine, and always seeking sex. These are all stereotypes pushed by toxic masculinity. And again, like I said, it is really great. I've noticed within my family and in my generation, like I have cousins that are men, and I haven't heard this saying in a very long time that you need to toughen up and not cry. Because men have emotions like women, and it is important that they're able to express them young so they're able to regulate them as they get older. Women are allowed to express emotion, and so we learn emotional regulation growing up. Men are always conditioned to keep everything in. That's not regulation. That's just going to show up somewhere else down the line. And there is still a disconnect, though, I have noticed within men. In my generation, for example, I had a friend group a while ago, and it was really interesting to see the dynamic because it was two of us girls and two guys, and we'd hang out. The guys, like, we'd leave them for hours, whatever, to do whatever they wanted to do, hang out, talk, and then we'd meet up and we'd hang out all together. But it was really interesting because every time we talked, we're like, oh, how is this thing and you're going on in your family? Or how is this thing that's your career change? Or some big event happening in your life? And the guy's like, I didn't know you were going through that. And it's like they didn't communicate things that were actually happening in their lives. They weren't building that relationality between each other. And so that was just really interesting to me that they weren't talking about anything really of substance from their lives. So how do you build a strong connection? How do you connect with other people and decrease the amount of loneliness you feel when you aren't opening up to people about what's actually happening with you? I just thought that was interesting, like the way they communicated versus we communicated, and the way we communicated with them was just completely different. Like we'd be very open talking about this is what's happening in our lives, this is how we're feeling about a certain thing, this is our thoughts on current politics or news or whatever it is. And the guys didn't talk about that. I don't know what they talked about, to be honest with you, but it was just really interesting that I'm like, how did you go for hours and not bring that up, right? And that's not to say that those guys were toxic or in any way. They were lovely. It was just a matter of you can kind of see where the difference in how men and women form relationships and how that is partly due to social programming. So there's a couple arguments that come up when people bring up toxic masculinity. And a big one that is promoted by especially far right men in the red pill pipeline kind of men is that toxic masculinity can't be helped because it is biological. Men are biologically designed to be dominant, to be violent, to control. Like that is what a lot of far right influencers have promoted. And yet, that's not true because there's also lots of healthy versions of masculinity that I have witnessed. And many men are inherently nurturing, kind, emotionally aware, and that doesn't make them less of a man. It just makes them a good person. And if people's definition again, like this is interesting too, because if toxic masculinity is your definition of man, that is the opposite of a good person. So then it's important to be a good person than anything. But there's plenty of room for men to be masculine without being toxic or engaging in behavior that's dangerous or hurtful. And I will let men determine what masculinity is to them. I think that's important. It's just important to also see that this stream of masculinity that's being propagated and promoted by certain influencers is not healthy and is not beneficial or going to progress as a people or society in any way, shape, or form. Like it's not helping men, it's not helping women, it's not helping anyone, this type of masculinity. And I just think it's really concerning that this is what is being promoted as an option. So I'm not trying to say this is how to be a man. I don't know what that's like. I'm not the gatekeeper on that. And I think we're going to tie that back in a minute here. But this idea that toxic masculinity is biological often discourages men from seeking mental health support or emotional help because they believe it can't be fixed. They are just inherently pent up with all this anger and emotional deregulation. and it's biological, which it's not. But they kind of come to this idea that they can't ask for help because of it. According to a survivor's website, or survivors.org, quote, placing blame on their biology made many of the men feel there was nothing personal they could do to improve their mood, reflecting the theme of powerlessness. This acceptance of the biomedical view means that compared to women, men use fewer alternatives or complementary therapies that rely heavily on being open, sharing, and talking about your feelings. Second, because men were more likely to blame mental and social health issues on biology, and thus see them as uncontrollable, they were less likely to seek help when lonely, promoting suicide as a legitimate way of taking control. End quote. And so it is actually really sad to see this happen because it's not biological. It's a social phenomenon that has programmed men to believe that this is who they are, or how their upbringing has taught them that this is what a man is. And it's like, first off, you're human. We're all human. First and foremost, that is what we are. And humans need connection, and humans need vulnerability, and humans need relationships. And humans have emotions. And so it is important for all of us to reach out and help one another. And everyone has feelings, and it's not biological or natural. Not. So I think that's really interesting. And it is really sad that is some men just feel like they can't escape it because of how they were socially conditioned. Another argument I've heard for toxic masculinity is that men aren't allowed to be aggressive now. Like aggression and violence is not as promoted or accepted by society. And it's become repressive to them and their internal violence. But is this because they haven't developed emotional regulation outside of anger? That's my question. Because yes, I understand that men have a tendency to be a little more aggressive. That's is a tendency of men. But at the same time, being like our society has become too non-violent and it doesn't allow men to express themselves, which is why they have a mental health crisis. It's like, no, if you actually just had emotional regulation or were able to share your emotions as a kid and develop emotional regulation, you wouldn't have this problem. And yes, you might still be a little more aggressive, but at the same time, you'd have coping mechanisms for that. Like when I get angry, I don't go and get really pissy at everyone else. I like go to a punching bag and punch the bag. Or I don't know, scream into my pillow. Like there's different ways to handle anger. And I feel like it's a challenge because if this perceived biological toxic masculinity that is in men, you don't develop coping skills. Be like, oh, it's natural. But it's like, yeah, it's also natural for women to be angry. Like women can get really angry. And yet we usually typically, if you're a developed human being, have coping mechanisms. The other challenge is that on the other side, on the exact opposite side on the left, there is also this argument that biology does not play a role in gender representation at all. And instead, gender is created through social and behavioral ideologies and like patterns. To be honest with you, I would say I do lean more this direction. I heavily think that gender is influenced by social behavior. For example, people are like, oh, like makeup's feminine. Like these are specific traits, obviously, like specific actionable traits that happen in and manifest in the physical world. But like women put wearing makeup, they're like that's feminine. It's like in ancient Egypt, men wore makeup all the time. And then you also have like, oh, pink's a girl color, blue's a boy color. And it's like 100 years ago, it was the exact opposite. Or if you look at like the Renaissance, it's like men wore heels, men wore dresses. It's just interesting because like in that capacity, gender representations change completely when society shifts and as people evolve. But I would say there is a slight biological component. Typically, like I do think that there is like testosterone obviously makes people slightly more aggressive, and women estrogen. So it's like not the same thing necessarily. Like we have different hormonal fluctuations which do affect mood and actional behavior. However, you cannot blame your entire actions on hormonal fluctuations because we have the ability to self regulate and be who we want to be outside of hormonal fluctuations. So, yes, biology plays a small role, in my opinion, on gender. It is society and our behavioral norms that has shaped gender representations quite heavily. As I was saying, I don't think either side is fully right. Because as we said, there is a healthy masculinity out there, and the way gender and masculinity have been presented have changed over time for centuries. Masculinity is also different to this day, depending on where you are in the world and the cultural and social environments you're in. It manifests differently, and there are different acceptable ways to represent your gender depending on the place in the world you're in. So it doesn't really have a strong biological component in some capacity. I find it really interesting when people call out toxic masculinity or have personalities, identities, or opinions that go against it because they're told they're emasculating men. For example, for me, one time I told a man that I wanted to make a lot of money. I wanted to make a lot of money as an adult. And I think I said this when I was like 15 or 16 or whatever. And personally, for me, I said I wanted to make more money than my husband. I wouldn't mind making more money than my husband. And that is partially because historically women who don't control finances are left in a shit position. And I just didn't, I had seen it and I'm like, I don't want that for me. So I was like, I want to make more money than my husband, or I want to have equal amount of money to my husband. And the man told me, he's like, well, your husband won't like it. And I was like, okay. And he said that it was because it would be emasculating to my future husband for me to make more or the same. Here's my thing. Here is my thing, okay, with emasculation. I don't think it exists. I don't think emasculation exists. I don't think it's an actual thing. Because there is no term for the opposite to be true for women. You can't take femininity out of a woman. Nothing you do in your personal life, whether that is take control or don't take control, whether you have this career or don't have this career, whether you make this amount of money or don't make this amount of money, none of that affects how I feel as a woman or my femininity. I'm secure in it. I'm not concerned. And so it's really interesting with emasculation because it tells me you're insecure in your masculinity. That's not my problem. It isn't. Because women don't have the equivalent, there's no like effeminating, new word, guys. I don't think it exists. And because for women as a gender as a whole, typically, we don't construct ourselves into this narrow expectation of how we are going to express femininity. Women can do whatever they want to be or do whatever they want to do and still be feminine if that is what they choose. I'm not going to think of someone as less of a woman because of their actions. If they identify as a woman, then I'm like, you're a woman. I'm not worried about how much money you make, what your career is, what you look like, what sports you play. Like, that is not my concern because you are now a woman. And that's like, I'm concerned if you hurt people, obviously, or if you do things that are not great, but that doesn't affect your femininity or identification as a woman. And so I think a large portion of this toxic masculinity we're discussing is that it creates this one idea of a man, which is upheld by both men and women. I will say that. I have heard women say things where I'm like, girl, don't be an ass. Like, men are allowed to be whatever they want to be for men, as long as it is a good human being. As long as you're a good human being, I don't care how you represent your gender. It is because of this narrow definition of masculinity that society has accepted, and like especially the far right has accepted, that is causing this massive mental health crisis. Like, if you can't fit into this, how are you a man? And it's like, what are you talking about? Because there's no narrow definition for femininity. It's like, if I don't have children, it's like I'm not a woman. But it's like not true at all. So it is this like narrow idea of how to be a man in the world that I think is causing a lot of mental health problems for men. One reel I saw by at Luke Bateman, who I think is Australian, actually argues against defining masculinity in any way. Masculinity is a prison for boys and men. But positive and healthy masculinity also doesn't work because masculinity is just coaching men on how to not be perceived as feminine or as a woman or as gay. The whole construct of masculinity is built on avoiding those labels. And I think I'm going to make another episode, another season about masculinity and femininity. But it is really interesting because there's no really definition for femininity. It doesn't matter how she presents herself. Like, and we might see her as more masculine, but she is still feminine. And it doesn't change that I view her however she would like me to identify her. But if it's a she, woman. So the idea that we need to have this rigid construction of masculinity is in itself crazy. It's crazy because, yeah, it is about you, because you have a rigid definition of masculinity. The whole point of it is to avoid the opposite, which is being defined as feminine. And feminine doesn't have a rigid definition. So it's kind of flow and ebb, and men's is like constructed and stuck. And it's like a lot of the things I have heard about how men define masculinity in my own life is that a lot of it's like, oh, I have this trait. I'm a protector. And it's like, what do you think women do? Like, what do you think? Do you think women don't protect the people they care about? Do you think mothers don't protect their children? Do you think women can't make as much money as men? Like, it's just really interesting the rigid definition that men need to hold their masculinity up so that they don't get defined as women or feminine or gay. And typically, gay is more associated with the feminine for whatever reason, because I guess we're more flexible definition. As Luke Bateman kind of said, masculinity as a definition often puts femininity on women down. It contributes to mental and emotional health problems for men. And masculinity should be individual to every person. It should be expressed however the person would like to express it. Not in a toxic way, but it should be a personalized experience for men. When we put boys towards achieving masculinity, we're actually putting them towards a goal that is unattainable. No one can be the perfect masculine man if you hold a rigid definition. That's not, because humans are not static. And if you have a static definition, people will never be able to achieve that consistently. I like what Luke Bateman said in his video because he also says the goal is not to be a good man or a good woman, but it is to be a good human being. Everything will fall into place if we work towards that. As long as we all work toward being the best people we can be and good people, everything else will fall in line. Luke's other problem with healthy masculinity is that the traits, like nurturing, kindness, empathy, those sort of things, are usually feminine. And he asks if men are really so fragile in the egos that they have to wrap kindness and empathy into palatable femininity by dressing it up as healthy masculinity. Which I think is really interesting too. I mean, you can chew on that a bit, but I really liked it when he said that because although those traits are typically reserved for femininity, they should not be. And I think that is largely because just to avoid being called feminine, they have been passed out from the toxic masculine definition of masculinity. Why can't we all just be good humans? Like, why do we have to have these rigid definitions for genders and femininity and masculinity? Why can't we just be good people? Like, again, like, first and foremost, you are a human being, and then you are your gender. The challenge is with toxic masculinity is that these traits don't just harm other people. They boomerang back and isolate the men who live in them. For example, okay, men's mental health. Men experience higher suicide rates than women. According to the Government of Canada, about 12 people die by suicide each day in the country. It is the second leading cause of death for youth and young people in Canada. And here's the statistic that's really interesting. Men are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than women. I argue that that is because emotional regulation is not preached to men at a young age because they're not allowed to express emotion and they are not able to seek help to the same degree because of these rigid definitions we've defined. Men are also more likely to overdose from opioid. We have an opioid crisis in Canada, and typically a lot of the people who are affected are men. There's women as well, but men are typically experiencing higher rates of overdosing. Men also typically lack emotional bonds when they practice toxic masculinity. And I think this is really interesting too because women are always claimed to be the more emotional gender. And I have talked to many, many people about this, and I always think it's interesting because I feel like when people say that, they forget that anger and depression are emotions too. When men grow up in this really rigid masculinity definition, they don't have the ability to express any emotions other than those two. And it's like, it's not that you don't have other emotions, it's that those are the only two avenues you've been told you can express yourself. And so every emotion you have comes out in those two ways. That's still emotional. Like you're just as emotional as women. Men and women are just as emotional as each other. I don't know where we got this idea that they're not. It's just the way we regulate and represent those emotions that kind of differs because of societal conditioning. And I think this is really interesting too because there's also this argument toxic masculinity that men don't naturally form emotional bonds with other men or other people, which is absolute bullshit because men are literally dying for emotional connection. So, how does a man up culture discourage emotional connection? Well, vulnerability is the cornerstone of emotional connection. And you don't have to be like a bleeding heart, but there is an aspect to forming a relationship that requires you to be vulnerable. And toxic masculinity has made vulnerability this demonic thing. So if you can't be vulnerable, you can't form genuine connection. So you isolate yourself in this loneliness. Another part of this is that vulnerability and like emotional connection is perceived as gay in many ways, which is really crazy to me because it's like you're a human being, you need it. It doesn't make you straight or gay. It's a necessary bond for humans. When I was living in Europe, actually, I did notice a bit of a difference in masculinity. For example, like here, men don't hold hands, men don't hug their friends, which is really sad, honestly, because women do that all the time with each other. We have those connections with our friends. But when I was living in Europe, it was very common for men to like hold hands, even though they were just friends, or to give each other hugs, or to tell each other they love each other, or just to like, bond and have that emotional and physical connection with other men who are their friends. It was just interesting to see how that differs from culture to culture because I know a couple of us who were exchanges were like, oh, that's really interesting that men hold hands here. And it's like not that they're in a relationship, it's just that they're friends. And I can't believe how shocked I was in some capacity because I'm like, that makes total sense. Like I do with my girlfriends, my friends that are girls. But we have pushed men so far into a box, they are literally dying because they don't know how to get out. And I that is so sad in so many ways. Also because they're told not to have emotional connections. They are discouraged from seeking professional help and it's heavily stigmatized. And I think this is across the board, it's heavily stigmatized, but like especially with my generation, it's getting more and more open, which is great to see. According to an Atlantic article, quote, the American Psychological Association introduced new guidelines for therapists working with boys and men, warning that extreme forms of certain traditional masculine traits are linked to aggression, misogyny, and negative health outcomes, end quote. That's really concerning, guys, that at industry level, we are having warnings about this rigid definition of masculinity. It's extremely concerning that we are at that level. And it's hard because suicidal ideation and behavior is consistently linked with loneliness, which is what happens when you don't have emotional connections. I'm not gonna lie, I think this episode is really challenging for a lot of people, and it was challenging for me to come across and write in a way that was reflective of being genuine towards men. And one thing I want to preface is that everything is changing for everyone. Mentally, we all struggle at some point, and especially now. Like the world has changed dramatically in the last 50 years. The way that we function, we have online tools. We can talk to anyone now. It's crazy the amount of things that have changed. And in some capacity, it has made all of our mental health worse. The consistent online connection, the disconnection from community, those things have made our mental health worse as a society. The challenge though is that this macho or alpha fake persona that men attach themselves to is causing mass loneliness and isolation. A study done on masculinity and mental health found, quote, work suggests that traditional masculine stereotypes that one should not talk openly about emotions or express their need for help creates a sense of loneliness that increases the risk for suicide, end quote. Again, all of this is leading to men killing themselves, which is crazy. It's absolutely insane that we as a society have accepted that this is how it is. This rigid definition of masculinity, especially this toxic masculinity that we talk about so much now from the far right, is not as promoted by women. There is trad wives, yes, they promote that. They're crazies. But the hard part is that a lot of this pain about rigid forms of masculinity is created and induced by men on other men. And we will talk more about that in the Red Pill Pipeline episode this season. And so, but it is our job as a society to be like, okay, enough is enough. Like, this is ridiculous. We don't need men to be shoved into this box. And again, women are also partly responsible for this, especially if they promote patriarchal or gender norms. A lot of it comes down to men just you have to be willing to leave the box. Think of the last time you saw a man hug his friend without joking about it. For some of us, that moment never comes to mind. So, what happens when you combine a culture that tells men not to feel with a reality where people are already struggling to connect? If vulnerability is a weakness, men can't open up. Dominance is a key aspect of toxic masculinity. And men's perceived dominance is also compared and contrasted with other men. They can't just be dominant over women or other minority groups. They need to be dominant over each other in this like toxic masculine sphere. And we've seen this in recent years as people talk about like the alpha or the beta males. Like it's basically an alpha is the one who seems the least feminine. It's weird, guys. I'm like, why? It also implicates their relationships. They have difficulty expressing emotions of love and affection towards loved ones, not just men, but also women. They struggle with that when you are so indoctrinated to this idea of masculinity. One major problem with this, though, is that because they don't know how to express emotion, they end up directing a lot of anger. And these are men who have subscribed to this masculinity, end up directing a lot of anger and aggression towards those closest to them. And that is why we see higher rates of gender based violence in men who express their masculinity in this way. They often are violent towards those they apparently care about. Quote, studies have found that domestic violence and sexual assault is most likely to occur in patriarchal cultures that strongly enforce gender roles, end quote. It is interesting to me in many ways, and this is a subtopic, but the toxic masculinity often promotes men as the protectors, and yet those men who subscribe to toxic masculinity are more likely to be predators and abusers. This is not to justify that behavior. Yes, we have created a society and a culture in which men are shoved into a rigid idea of masculinity, and that needs to change. That does not justify or make you responsible to change those men. It is the men's job in those cultures to come out of it and change themselves. Because it's not just beneficial to the relationships, it's not just beneficial because it'll decrease violence against women and minorities. It's beneficial because it will make them less lonely. And yes, they are struggling. I'm saying this mostly because women who get stuck in abusive relationships feel sympathy and pity and think they can change a person. And that's why they stay. And it's like, no, just leave. Let it go. Like if they're being violent towards you, they have to come out of that themselves. It is not your job to change them. Side note. And again, like if asking for help is shameful, men can't seek support. If closeness is feminized, friendships stay shallow. And it creates this lack of support and connection. The consequences of this is that friendships often dissolve after high school or college, and like relationships become very transactional. They're either work or sports or drinking buddies. Like there's not a lot of depth to them. They're just surface level relationships, which is fine to have a couple of those. We all do. You just can't have all of your relationships be like that. A big part of how toxic masculinity ends up putting a lot of pressure on women is that romantic partnerships become the only place for intimacy, the only place for vulnerability, which creates a huge pressure for the relationship itself. And so there's this term going around, the male loneliness epidemic. And it is largely people who say they largely blame women for not having romantic relationships with men. That is why men are lonely. That is the logic behind that. The challenge, I do think it exists. I think men are incredibly lonely in a lot of ways. I don't think it's women's problem to solve. Women are single at the same rates as men, and yet we don't have a women loneliness epidemic because we have built connections and created relationships that sustain us outside of romantic ones. And so this blame that men are lonely because women won't be with them, it is because there is a history of putting too much emotional and vulnerable connection on romantic relationships. And if that is where men think they're the only place they are allowed to be emotional or connective with other people, then of course they're going to think that's the problem. But it's like, actually, you're huge. That's like a subsection of the problem. The huge problem is that you won't connect with anyone else. Like, that is not women's problem. That's not our fault in a lot of ways. And so, as much as this problem is really distressing and depressing, obviously, because it leads to certain like mental health and suicidal outcomes, it is not women's problem to solve the male loneliness epidemic. It isn't. And so, the cultural observation I've had about toxic masculinity is that the locker room talk. So men are often forced to conform to stereotypes through bullying and peer pressure. And that's the whole thing where it's like, oh, that's so gay. Like that's a quote, guys. That's so gay. It's like it's a form of bullying. I hate to tell you that is a form of bullying. And you might mean it as a joke. But over time, those things really do impact how men perceive gay men. Or you like throw like a girl. It's like, okay, that also impacts how you perceive women and girls. And it's so like if the worst thing a man can be is gay or a girl, it's like, okay, you guys have a problem. It is often men who bully and peer pressure other men who achieve this idea of masculinity because it is unachievable. It's an insecurity. If men can never hit the peak of toxic masculinity as it is shared, then there's an insecurity there. They're like, oh, I have to guarantee my masculinity. And so then that creates dominance over other men, which creates bullying and peer pressure, which drives more men into thinking they need to achieve this masculine ideal. It's a pretty bad cycle. I'm not gonna lie. It sounds like a pretty awful cycle. And so to prove manliness, men often end up hurting both themselves and others. And this kind of ties into how locker room talk and like this kind of bullying and peer pressure ends up becoming a lot of rape culture. And that's a huge correlation between like how men talk about women when they're not around or how men talk to each other within groups and how that contributes rape culture and violence against minorities. This isn't just sad. It is dangerous for everyone. Loneliness isn't only emotional, it's physical. It increases the risk of early death and long-term health problems. And so I do understand, like it's really hard. It's really hard to be a man right now. I can't say it's not really hard to be a man right now. Everything has changed. And in the last 50 years regarding gender roles, like women don't need men financially anymore. In the vast majority of the developed world, we don't depend on men financially. And I mean, it's not necessarily true in income levels, like men still make more than women, but we can open our own bank accounts, which is not something my grandmother could do. We can vote, we can do all these different things. And so we have this individual autonomy and this ability to go out into the world and create ourselves without a man. And that has never occurred in like a long, long time in Western culture. Women are getting more educated at the post-secondary level than men. There is more women in universities than there is men. Women are more likely to be single homeowners than men now, even. And the challenge for men is that the breadwinner, or this idea that has been passed down from generation to generation to what to strive to as a man, the breadwinner, the emotionally distant husband and father, isn't needed anymore. It isn't desired anymore. There are more gender identities and more LGBTQ plus couples changing gender norms even further. Toxic masculinity doesn't adapt to the times. It doesn't push for a world where we all coexist. It demands that traditional gender roles be upheld and rigidly puts men in a chokehold position. That they have to be man enough to hold onto their masculinity in these changing times. And it's a lie. Unfortunately, these narrow definitions of what it means to be a man can lead to feelings of insecurity, depression, and ultimately loneliness. Men who do not adapt to the times we're in are not more of a man. They're actually failing evolution, which makes me mean, but they are. The body positivity movement says, quote, when men are given permission to act in non-gender ways, the tellability of the issues is increased. More inclusive and discursive and versions of masculinity are formed, end quote. We need to let go of what this one idea of masculinity is. We need to let go of needing a definition for masculinity at all. It is not healthy for men or for women or for us as a society. And that is really hard to think about, especially if you've been told since birth that this is how a man is, or a man needs to be this, or whatever the case is. That's a really hard thing to do, to let go of something that has been so ingrained and programmed into you. And yet it's not helping you. It's not helping anyone else. So why hold on to it? Truly, toxic masculinity or even rigid ideas of masculinity are performance. You're performing to fit in. It's not a truth. It's not a fundamental truth to who you are. It's a performance, right? Like, if a woman can be anything she wants to be and still be a woman, that's not a performance. That's just who she is. But if you were like, I have to be this to be a man, you're performing. It's not true. There's one thing that I thought was interesting is that I don't know if you guys had seen the video, but there was a woman journalist covering a sports event at Oregon State College. And it was a video that circulated quite widely online. And she was trying to do the interview And these group of guys started interrupting her and like would not stop going in front of the camera, calling at her, all this different stuff. And this was from, I think, late last year. But they end up walking off screen, and it's so sad because you can see her just like start, like a tear falls down her cheek because she just couldn't, there's nothing she could do. She was trying to maintain professionality, and these men thought it was funny to ruin her segment. It was definitely like harassment for the reporter. And as one Instagram influencer said, this type of masculinity is a masculinity that is a performance for other men. And men started doing it because they were in a group of other men. Men perpetuate and perform for other men when they conform to these toxic masculine and disruptive and ill-behaved manners. As this creator says, being a good man means valuing respect over relevance. So the question is, how do men break down the stigma around men's emotion and create a healthy space for real masculinity? Because let's be honest, it's a show. Ask your friends, who are your close friends? Do you tell them how you really feel? They're just small steps, like check in with a male friend. Compliment without irony. It doesn't have to be a joke. If your friend looks really good today, say, you look really good today. Or, hope you do well in the test. Or whatever it is. Yes, it's a small microdose of vulnerability. But that is how you actually create connections. You have to also be willing to maybe share something personal. Like if you're like, oh, I got in a fight with my parent. Or I haven't cleaned my house in a couple days. I'm just kind of struggling with work-life balance. Those things are important for relationships. You also have to highlight healthy masculinity and vulnerability. Be kind, emotionally aware, walk the talk, use empathy. These are all key aspects. There's also a big role for therapy and community spaces, peer groups, and role models. If you think you need help professionally, go seek help. It is not embarrassing, it is necessary. There is an importance in redefining strength. Strength doesn't mean dominance, it means being honest, being vulnerable, having empathy. Those are harder things to achieve than just sheer dominance and bulldozing. I will tell you from experience, empathy is a hard thing to have. And yet, it is what makes us human, and it is vital. It's scarier and it's easier to act like you don't care. That doesn't make you strong. So, a couple examples I thought I'd bring up at the end of this is that there are already men and groups organized by men who are taking initiative to tackle this rigid form of masculinity that is attacking and killing men. For example, a lot of men will post about Movember and they'll be like, men's mental health. It's important. And it's like, yes, I think that's so important. The Movember movement is such a great movement in so many ways. I think it's also important for people who are participating in it actually think, okay, why do men have a mental health crisis? Because I often see a lot of men post about Movember and then be like, don't think about why it is that men have higher rates of suicide or lack emotional vulnerability because it's not biological. They just don't consider it. There are a couple hashtags and celebrities and influencers I thought I'd mention at the end of this podcast. I really love at Maya and Hunter. They're a couple on Instagram. I think they show such a beautiful way that relationships can be. Hunter, especially in this relationship, is really interesting to me because he expresses vulnerability. He plans parties for his wife. It's sad in some ways, but it is not common necessarily to see that kind of supportive relationship on and off screen. That's a great one. Maya and Hunter is a really great one I like to watch for like just hope and like what a great relationship could be. There's also the hashtag for the love of men on Instagram that I saw that was really great. Hashtag healthy masculinity, which is also really cool. And again, tying back to Luke Bateman, I don't necessarily think we should have a rigid definition for masculinity, which includes healthy masculinity. But these are just terms we can use to start branching out and getting away from the toxic masculine rigid definition that somehow has become created. Also, hashtag male body positivity. Because I think like that's also a big thing for men is that body positivity is kind of an insecurity, and then that create isolation, and that also ties back into toxic masculinity and all this different stuff. So that's a great one as well. There are a few influencers and public figures who have opened up about mental health and their struggles with the definition of masculinity. This includes like Terry Crews, Dwayne Johnson, Trevor Noah, Pedro Pascal, Chris Evans, and even LeBron James. Holding fast to traditional ideas of masculinity, echoed in toxic masculinity, doesn't protect men. It destroys them and their relationships. Men must do better for other men. The rest of us need to support them through this transition. We don't pressure men to conform to masculine ideals of the past, as it hurts them and us in the long run. Men must lead the charge for this change in masculinity, but we, as a group of women, must support them. We're all in this changing world together, and we cannot allow toxic masculinity to continue. Men need space to find what healthy and real masculinity looks like to them. And that could just mean a fluid version of masculinity. That could just mean not defining it, which is okay too. I'll leave you with this. What if we raised boys with the same permission to cry, to hug, to connect as we raise girls with? How different might our world look? Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, pass it along to a friend, drop a quick review, and let's keep chatting on Instagram. Let me know what your experience with masculinity is, and share this with others who you think might enjoy learning about men's mental health. Sharing is caring, and it helps this podcast grow and reach new audiences. I'll see you in the next episode.